Hello.
Hey man, how's it going?
Good. How you doing?
Pretty well. Getting going.
Yeah,
Let's see.
having a slow morning over here for me. But
Cool.
yeah, what do you want to chat about? I think some of my chat doesn't know what the IPCC is or the sixth assessment is, so that would probably be a good place for us to start.
Okay. Yeah. Well, the IPCC is the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, I think.
Yeah.
Yep. And basically, every year they report multiple reports on what's happening with climate change, global climate change, and this particular one is the latest one that just came out. And I think the best way to go about it would be kind of just going over the figures and talking about them. Like the figures are more visual, so it might be the best way to actually engage people. And yeah, I think it has some interesting implications just for like what's going on today with the climate, but then also ways that people can actually interact and be proactive in their own ways. I think that's the big takeaway from this one.
Okay. Yeah, I agree with that. I have skimmed the sixth assessment summary for policymakers, and I've read some of the surrounding articles and the thread by Sarah Lynn Birch.
Okay, cool.
And a couple other things. So when I went over it, I was really looking mostly for where it deviated from the fifth assessment, because I spent a lot of time with the fifth assessment.
Okay, cool.
And I was pretty familiar with a lot of the RCPs and the different benchmarks that we had to hit for the different potential futures for what global warming was going to bring.
Mm-hmm.
But when I went through the summary for policymakers, I was mostly looking for all right, are we still using that concentration pathway model? And what are the benchmarks that we're looking at now? Because I figured when it came out, we were going to be looking at, they have moved forward the amount of degrees that is minimum. And and that's pretty much what I saw, is that the fifth assessment was mostly talking in below 1 degree Celsius, and now it seems pretty accepted that we're going to be hitting 1.5, right?
Yeah, I think this is figure. This is they go over this on figure 4, SPM 4. Here, I can link the in your chat.
Oh, sure.
There you go. Yeah, I mean it's one of those things where greenhouse emissions. So there's the IPCC report, and then there's also what people kind of can't also focus on in their lives and have a direct impact on, in my opinion. The 1.5 degrees Celsius, I think it's important to think about, especially if you're an ecologist or a geologist, or you have a climate science background or something like that. But that can be kind of hard to understand, I think, for a lot of people. Because 1.5 degrees higher, that can just seem okay, that's really nothing. Your temperature changes a lot outside, which is, behooves the question, what's the difference between climate and weather and all these convoluted questions, as opposed to kind of the health of the environment. And I think that's kind of where people can kind of look at and then have a big impact on specifically.
Yeah, because there's a couple of different levels to the problem because of the scales of it, right? So
Exactly.
You're saying, there's the everyday, where people actually interact with the environment on a daily basis. Mm-hmm. And then there's the big degree benchmarks, the emissions benchmarks, and macro level policy that affects the economy that the government can make. What kind of energy do we consume? How much of it do we consume? How much emissions are we capping particular industries at? Stuff like that.
Yeah, exactly. Because we can, at the worldwide level, it kind of makes sense to focus, and especially it makes sense for if you're a nation, right? It makes sense why you're kind of paying attention to emissions, because that actually impacts you. But at the same
Right.
time, like, you can buy a Tesla and then you're not gonna be able to watch the global temperature drop because of that. You know what I mean? Like, you're not looking at your
Yeah.
personal contributions and stuff like that. So, like, in my opinion, I like to tell people to kind of just focus on what they think is the most important issue, because there's a lot of ways that humans are impacting the environment. And
Right.
how like what's the way that you care about the most? And for a lot of people, that's not necessarily going to be CO2 ppms, because I think CO2 ppms is kind of ephemeral. It's like, what is a ppm?
Sure.
What is CO2? Like what? And there's no face to CO2. You know what I mean? Maybe they're like more inclined to like for example, I think you like fish a lot. So
Yeah.
if I were you, if I was talking to you and maybe you were like more skeptical or you wanted to know some like action, then maybe the CO2 ppms actually does make a big difference, because the CO2 in the air dissolves into the ocean, and that creates carbonic acid, which lowers the pH of the ocean pretty dramatically. And that makes a big difference for the calcium bicarbonate shells that sea creatures make it with their shells, and it also just impacts coral bleaching and all these other things, because corals aren't just one organism. The vast majority of corals are actually two organisms. You have kind of like the organism that's doing the structure, and then you have a photosynthetic organism that's within that. So, go ahead.
And ocean acidification also affects the oxygen content of the water, right? Doesn't it affect how oxygen-rich water can be?
That's an interesting question. I don't know. Maybe. I mean, that I do know, as kind of like a separate issue. This is a good example of how we're kind of like messing up with the environment in multiple ways. There's oxygen minimal zones off the coast of every single city in the world, and basically that's where we put nitrates. Nitrates run off of our farming, and they flow into the oceans, and then that causes huge blooms in algae, cyanobacteria, diatoms, that kind of stuff, and it creates a big boom and then a bust basically, and all that oxygen then falls and with the dead organisms to the bottom of the sea basically, and that's why you have these huge schools of fish. You had like, wow, 2,000 fish just like randomly died on the coast of blank. And that's because they ran into one of these oxygen minimal zones where there is no oxygen in the water anymore.
Yeah, I think they call them dead zones. Those things are crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree that being able to focus in on those little like issues that people care about more is really helpful for talking to people about climate change. But I think the other problem with focusing on more ethereal things like ppm can be that it runs into the other problem where people feel like they're powerless to affect things that exist on that scale, so they just don't care about them.
Exactly. Yeah, I totally agree. Yeah, I mean, so like specifically for like fish, like you can have like, there's actually a mass extinction going on right now, specifically because of humans are overeating the fish populations. We're taking a lot of fish from the ocean, and we're not letting those natural populations kind of get back up to normal levels again. And this is kind of like running up into climate change, and where and this goes into like the adage, like, people are like, well, why don't they just evolve, right? Why don't the organisms just evolve to get better? And it's like, well, it's called a genetic bottleneck effect. I say these words like genetic, like science terms, not to use jargon and confuse people, but these are the terms that you would search for if you're interested in it. And then my goal is to like define the terms so they're not like crazy, but
Oh, it's a good concept to use for the conversation as well, because that is what's happening, right? Like the rate of change is outstripping the ability of the organisms to adapt to their environment.
Exactly.
So it's producing this massive bottleneck. Yeah.
Exactly. So you're removing all these organisms from the population, because remember, populations evolve, not individuals. So the population dwindles in numbers, and then what happens is that now that population goes through a speciation event, which it can be abiotic or biotic. So biotic is anything biological, abiotic is anything environmental. So in this case, it would be abiotic, right? And normally, like, you would have a lot of organisms in the population, and then they would be able to adapt because they have a lot of genetic mutations in the population, and they're able to thrive. In this case, since we're removing all of those fish and removing all those these organisms, they're not able to evolve. Basically, we're removing their ability to go through natural selection. So natural selection is the one that happens on the single organism. Evolution is happening at the population level, and then speciation comes out after. So we're kind of like we're messing with the environment, which is causing its own extinction, and then we're causing our own extinction through human events, and that's impacting how our environment is going to be able to react in the future.
Yeah, totally. So when you talk about climate change with other people, I imagine this is a lot of the way that you try to talk about it, right? You're engaging in this very like important to a person at the individual level kind of ways. But what kind of suggestions do you usually make to them about the kinds of things they can do to impact the problem? Because I'm like a pretty big doomer about climate change, and I think that this comes from like where I engage with it first, because I engage with it at the policy level and not really at the individual level. All of my first learning and reading about climate change was done through a competitive event called Policy Debate. Okay. So we would take climate change and use it as an impact argument, as like a bad thing that is happening in the future that we need to try to solve. Yeah. And we'd look at it from the hypothetical lens of like, what could the government potentially do to solve this problem? Mm-hmm. So I think about it very much in terms of like, what kinds of governmental actions are necessary to stop us from hitting the worst, like, sort of like feedback loops for like later on down the road impacts that will come from climate change. And because I've spent so much time thinking through all the like little things that can happen, like the impact that it'll have on the Atlantic Meridional overturning current, or like the impact that ocean acidification will have, or like the way that ice melting fucks up the temperature at the bottom of the ocean, or, you know, like all the like little run-on effects. It's hard for me to engage with it in an everyday way. What would you say is the best way for me to do that?
Okay, cool. Perfect. This is a great segue into like figure 7 and 8. So, figure 7 and 8 kind of go through the impacts that each of these individual actions kind of have. So I think we could do like probably figure 8 first, because figure 8 actually has a lot of different things that a lot of people wouldn't normally associate with climate change, but ways that they can actually contribute. So like for example, excuse me. So like I would say the framing of climate change before is kind of like a STEM heavy, you could only contribute unless you're either passing policy in regards to like emissions, or if you're a scientist working on solving one of these technological problems. But what I like about figure 8 and what they talk about in those points that one of the lead authors of the report said, I mean, there's a lot of different ways that we can actually impact that. So like, for example, like transport, if you go, it's figure 8, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 at the fifth grouping down.
Yeah.
You know, like for example, the ability, and then basically the horizontal are ways that you could impact it, and the vertical are ways that are sustainable development goals. So these are like ways that we could actually change the conversation. So for example, gender equality, 5. So if you go down on column 5, you can actually see the light, and the light blue and the dark blue is ways that with lower and higher confidence that they're able to meet these goals. So, for example,
Right.
so column 5, if you go down, like shift to public transport is actually a way that, with high confidence, that we can actually positively impact the environment through gender equality. So that's something that maybe people didn't realize, right? That maybe how is and then it begs the question: how is gender equality? How does that link with shift to a public transport, and how does that impact climate change? Right? It's like, well, if you read the report, they actually go into how women have more time on public transport, even though they go a lower amount of miles. So it makes them, when they're equal in a society, it allows them to invest more into these public infrastructure bills that make public transport, and then that public transport reduces emissions. So there's not really like one way that we can. There's not just one way, we just need people to be involved however they want to be involved, and whatever they think is their pet issue, like run with that. That's what I would tell people. Like there are individual ways that you can change like your actions. Like, for example, like palm oil, like don't buy palm oil. There's no reason to. It sucks.
Yeah.
It's really bad. It's really destructive to the environment. Just don't buy palm oil. But then there's other ways of like, hey, I really care about gender equality, or I'm a lawyer that wants to do that. It's like, just do that. That's fine. Like just keep pushing, and you're contributing. We just need people to be involved and engaged. I think that's the biggest takeaway from this main thing. That's
report. Really interesting to me. I've never seen something by the IPCC like this before, where alongside the statement for policymakers, they're also saying here are a bunch of other intersecting issues that affect climate change.
Exactly.
You don't have to be an electrical engineer who works on new battery technology to make like solar sustainable in order to try to solve the problem, right? So that there are people across sectors that would normally feel like, well, I'm not specialized to deal with this problem, so I hope that the smart scientist man figures it out in time. We don't all die.
Exactly.
Right? And instead, they be like, well, I want to be a teacher, or I want to like distribute affordable and clean energy, or I want to like do water sanitation, and their work in those fields can contribute to some kind of daily solution to the problem, right? Because I think the other things, like, while I'm very doomer about a lot of benchmarks in terms of emissions, that climate change is a much more multifaceted problem than just temperature and emissions. Like, there are a lot of other things going on in it, and the Sustainable Development Goals in particular, I think, are really important for highlighting that, because it shows that climate change is going to be a problem that threatens all aspects of the political environment, and not just like the temperature outside.
Exactly.
It's going to be about about access to potable water, about access to like food security, and the changes to the environment that will come in the future are going to drive a lot of events that will cause political instability that we need to sort of like prepare our systems for, because it will produce systemic shocks for like basically everybody's economy, everybody's political system, that sustainable development projects can actually prepare us for.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that's the big takeaway too. And I was surprised to see this in the report too. I really liked it. Figure 7 talks about like the ways that each of those previously stated development plans has a big impact, like on net emissions, for example. Net emissions is kind of like the thing that people use because, one, it's intergovernmental, right? It impacts everyone. So that's kind of like why, like as a government, you would want to focus on that. But, maybe like as a person, like maybe you care about whatever issue or whatever specific animal, so you can focus in on that. And then it kind of like makes something so daunting and so big and so worldwide into kind of like a local issue that you can actually make a real big impact on. So like, for example, we know it's actually really easy in ecology. We know this really well. What makes a healthy, productive environment is having a lot of species and having a lot of animals of that species in the environment. So it's those two things, right? So we want to conserve the animals and the species that exist already in the environment, and we also want to rehabilitate or bring back if they went extinct or if they migrated, bring them back to the environment. So so with that in mind, now it becomes like, oh dang, I could actually go to my city hall meetings and impact climate change or the human's detriment to the environment, or our impact, by like looking at zoning and all these kind of like weird things that you wouldn't think were connected. But yeah, now it's like, maybe we shouldn't build that condo mall that further bisects like our natural living, our green spaces, or our wild spaces, whatever you want to call it. Because what happens, like one of the big problems with what we're doing is making basically the wild parts of the environment kind of like an archipelago, or it's like an island and an island and an island. And what we want is like them to be kind of like connected, right? So that's some way that people can actually have a huge impact is going into like city hall meetings and stuff like that, or going joining the boards and committees that your city hall has that has any type of power on type of this. And some of them are not elected. So there's a lot of ways that people can get involved that aren't elected at city hall that maybe take 5 to 10 hours a month, and that would actually have a huge impact.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's really interesting when I'm looking at this graph. One of the things that actually stands out to me is how low the contribution to net emission reduction from nuclear energy would be.
Yeah.
It's really shocking to me that it's so much lower than everything else. I imagine that's because of the amount of concrete that's required to be laid to produce a nuclear power plant, right?
That's a good question. I don't know specifically. Yeah, I don't know.
Because concrete is a huge emitter. Like the construction industry does a lot of damage in terms of the amount of concrete that it uses.
Yeah, wind and solar is kind of an interesting thing. I mean, wind and solar are really important for. I mean, it really pales in comparison to anything else. I mean, the reason why. I mean, one, the problem with nuclear energy is I have a video on my YouTube channel that goes over nuclear energy, but the problem with it is that it just isn't renewable. So, I mean,
right.
It makes sense for nations that don't have a lot of land, that are really densely populated, and they don't have space for wind farms or solar arrays and all that kind of stuff. Like, for example, Japan, it's an island, landlocked nation, so it actually really behooves them to have and be able to generate their own electricity in a really small amount of space. For us, for the United States, we have a ton of space for wind and solar, so it doesn't really make any sense for us to be investing a lot into nuclear energy, for example. And I mean, this is a really big problem too. People don't realize that. Like, let's say, for example, I live in the United States. I want to contribute to the fight against the humans, negatively impacting the environment. So I buy an electric car, right? Well, if you live in 60% of the United States, it's going to be basically fracking material that you're burning at the local power plant. At some parts of the United States, you're actually still doing coal. Like I think it's like Missouri and stuff like that. You're still doing coal. So what powers your electric car that you think you're doing so good at the so well for the environment with is actually coal. You're burning coal to power your electric vehicle. It's like it blows my mind, but it's true.
And there are parts of the country where you're still using oil-fired electricity too, like in Texas or Louisiana, where they still have oil-fired plants. It's an interesting displacement effect, right? Because people originally wanted to kind of focus on transitioning to electric vehicles as they're like, this is how we can reduce emissions the most. But it kind of just kicks the can down the road in terms of where the electricity comes from. And it's actually like the change to the grid and the portfolio of energy that we design, that the government wants to consume every year, that is going to determine where most of our emissions end up coming from. I find it's really interesting, though, that the reduced conversion of forests and other ecosystems would have a net larger contribution to emissions reduction than wind energy. It's amazing how important it is to focus on things like reforestation and ecosystem restoration. Because one of the stats that I remember from the fifth assessment is that for the renewable concentration I don't think renewable is the right word. For the concentration pathway that they predicted to keep it under 1 degree Celsius, they said we had to reforest like roughly a third of the surface of the planet by 2050. And I thought that was really interesting. Like, it's not just about net reduction, but about like forest restoration as well, because there's such an important part of how the planet like naturally regulates the level of carbon in the air.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's that. There's natural CO2 like takedown from the plants, but then there's also just like a healthy ecosystem is going to have and work in that carbon cycle that the world has existed with for a billion years, billions of years with life. So yeah, it really focuses in on a lot of that. Like for me, like as a biologist, I care about living organisms. I don't have an innate attraction to a CO2 molecule, but like a dead animal, like I think about that. Like, dang, that's really sad. For example, like I lived in San Diego for a really long time, and I would go snorkeling out in La Jolla, and there's this story of the Steller sea cow. Have you heard about that?
I think so.
Yeah, the Steller sea cow was like basically the manatee of the Pacific Ocean, and it went extinct within like 15 years of the humans discovering it. It's just an absolutely atrocious way that people just did not care about the environment, and big sea bass too. You can actually see on the Hotel del Coronado these big pictures of these dudes, hanging their big giant sea bass up, and there's so many of them, and they're so proud of themselves. And it really hit home, like where I'm like, damn, dude, I actually, like, they robbed me of that experience of actually being able to snorkel with these magnificent organisms, and now I can't do that because of these idiots, like just hunting them to extinction, and it really hit home with me, like, dang, like I have all these amazing experiences right now when I'm surfing with dolphins and all that kind of stuff, and it really hit home to me that, like, man, I need to conserve these dolphins so that my kids can have that experience with the ocean too, and connect with the dolphins in that way too.
Yeah, I think that kind of thinking is really important and a good way to hook people into having a more conservationist mindset, because like despite all the dooming I can do about the numbers for the environment, none of that adds up to like an individual sort of disposition towards life, right? Like I can say, oh, well, the problem looks really bad from a numeric standpoint, but that doesn't tell me how to act or what to do with my life. And I think that's what most people are actually looking for. Most people aren't looking to have a policy conversation about something like global warming, because what are they going to do about it? Like they can petition their congressperson, but that's not exactly going to be enough. If that was enough, we would have been doing something about it a long time ago. So they feel kind of powerless and just want to find ways individually that they can make an impact. And I think that doing things like telling them to have kind of a closer experience with the environment, that can make them personally attached to it in a way that they want to be active for and that they want to preserve, is probably one of the best ways to get people involved.
I totally agree. Because the problem is the first thing that you talk to someone about in climate change is that, especially people that are skeptical about the humans having an impact, is like the hockey stick graph. It's like, so that's the first thing that happens. And that's the graph where we're measuring global atmospheric CO2, and it just shoots up like a hockey stick at the very end, where it's going along and in the last however 100 years or whatever, it's able to just go up. So, and it's kind of like this atmospheric, and it can feel kind of, it can feel daunting, man. Obviously, when you're looking at a global problem like that, it can feel just like I mean, think about how people feel about national politics, where how it seems so unproductive, and now we're going to a global area, a global level. Like, oh my gosh!
Right.
And now you get all these people talking about, and that's why you get a lot of people that are skeptical about humans impacting the environment. Going, okay, well, I don't want an NWO like government, and because that's what you're talking about, a global issue
Right.
that obviously is going to have to be a one world government. And it's like, we gotta reshift our thinking on this a little bit. I think it would have a big impact on just how people view this stuff in general. So that's kind of like my goal.
I think one of the advantages to working from that kind of way of talking to people, where you're focusing on what individually people can do, is that it puts a much more positive kind of maybe mindset is the word that I'm looking for. It frames the issue of climate change not just in terms of the catastrophic events that we predict will happen as a result of climate change, but in terms of like what we can do to create a more sustainable future. Like when we were looking at Figure 8, and it's talking about sustainable development goals. Like, I think framing it as a sustainable development problem makes it a lot more approachable for people than framing it as this is a massive like global problem that requires a new world order, because like no individual country is capable of lowering net emissions for the world and stuff like that. Because like there are so many framing problems that come along with looking at the problem on a bigger scale. Like you were saying, even governments are already pretty bad at acting quickly and in unison, and then you try to talk about it on a scale that is larger than a single government, and people's brains are all the way up in the sky. Like they have no idea what to do with themselves. But if you're talking about these problems in terms of like, well, we need to convince people first before we can solve any of this to be on the same page with conservation efforts and sustainable development, with like the idea that the way we've organized the economy is itself unsustainable, and that we need to make everyday changes in the way that we live in the world so that we can make it sustainable.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of this is just kind of like phasing out old buildings too. People are like, well, now we have to make every single building again. That's it's like, well, no. But just having those small impacts, they build up, and where you have insulation or what I'm really excited about personally is like new type of biomaterials. So ways that we can make materials that are biodegradable but strong as concrete. That's like a really interesting idea. I work with chloroplast biotechnology in my own research, so I'm really interested in living materials that can actually grow and get like stronger. It's crazy. They actually created this plant material that basically it can be used as a building material, but then you can like basically grow it, and it photosynthesizes, and it gets stronger and stronger over time, which is a really cool idea. I think that's
awesome.
Yeah.
So what do you see some of the uses for something like that being?
So it could be like new buildings and stuff like that, where you have, once you reduce the cost enough, you could create tax incentives, or however the local government wants to incentivize new projects to use things like that.
Interesting. I think that there are a lot of applications for things like that are going to come out. What do you think about, because one of the things that does bother me in the climate change discussion is exactly how much of the chart is taken up by industrial agriculture.
Yeah, that's really bad. It's a really bad thing.
It's like one of the main drivers of the problem, right? Because we could fully switch to wind and solar and we would still have a climate problem. So what do you think going forward is a good sustainable development model for how humanity needs to change its relationship with food?
Food's an interesting one because it has a lot of like cultural significance for a lot of people. So I'm thinking about like Japan and their like whaling. I'm thinking about people just like barbecue. Like I like to barbecue and stuff like that, and can kind of like people have like a cultural significance to some things, to particular types of meat or particular organisms that they like to eat or don't eat. But I think what's important is like one, like if we're going to talk about individual things that we can do is like meatless Mondays or something like that. It seems kind of like arbitrary. Like what, like how in the world am I going to solve climate change by just not eating meat one day out of the week? But it adds up, and those small little individual actions like do add up. On a more like governmental level, I mean, we basically subsidize the meat industry massively. Mm-hmm. Like it's, a lot of money that goes to that. So, in my opinion, we could definitely start, subsidizing these lab grown meat alternatives. And that kind of like allows us to start making the shift over to something that's more renewable, sustainable for the long term. So like, for example, there's like, the Impossible Burger and all that kind of stuff where it's an all vegan like option. But at the same time, like, there's a, what is it? The McDonald's burger, like the patty is only like 30% beef anyway. So it's like, I mean, how much are people are going to know? There's also alternate protein models too. So like that 30% of the beef that's actually beef could be from like insects and stuff like that. So you can actually buy, like right now, you can buy insect powder that's a protein that you can actually like use it with your own cooking. So it's kind of like a protein powder, but with insects. So, stuff like that, there's individual actions, and then there's us like just subsidizing, kind of like the wrong thing. And especially when it comes to farming, because you're actually removing natural like an ecosystem too, because you have to have all that land, right? And then specifically with meat, now you're actually growing plants and have their water issues, their water intakes, in order to feed the cows or whatever. So it has a huge impact on what's going on. So like, for example, the soy and corn, I think soy and corn is like 70% of farmlands in the United States right now.
It's a really high number, yeah.
Yeah, only 1% of soy is for human consumption. Only 9% of corn is for human consumption. Pretty much all
it's
of
used
that.
For animal.
Exactly. Yeah, the vast majority for corn. For corn, there is a lot. The corn ethanol. So some of it is used for. It basically is converted into a bioplastic kind of thing. So that's where we get a lot of plastics. But then it's also where we get a lot of our ethanol for our cars and our gas. But a lot of it is just feedstock, man. So we have a huge problem. So it's not just like my point is that it's not just like the animal farm. It's all like the corn fields and the soy fields and stuff that are also being impacted, and then the water that's needed, and then the CO2 emissions from transporting all that stuff. It adds up. It adds up a lot.
And then the impact that has on the soil when you continue to monocrop soy on the same area or monocrop corn on the same area, right?
Yeah,
because it also has like soil erosion effects and all of that shit.
Exactly. So you got to like rotate them, and you have to put legumes in there in order to, because they have nitrifying microorganisms in their roots that'll help bring down nitrogen gas from the atmosphere. Personally for me, like I would love to see people kind of have a new relationship with their food where kind of know where it's coming from. And part of that would be like learning like how to process meat. I think excuse me one second.
Sure.
I think a big part of that would be like in high school or in education, killing something, like hunting something, and then processing that meat. You know, like killing it and then skinning it and then breaking it down and then carving it and carving it up. And then that's like that's how a cow's processed or something like that. Because right now we have different names for food, right? We have like cows for the animal, but then beef as the thing. And when you see beef in the supermarket, it's just so nice and beautiful and just like this little package. But you have no idea what happened to go to that stage. And I think if a lot of people had to process their own meats and kill their own organisms in order to have meat, I think a lot more people would be vegetarian personally.
I think that would also be true if a lot more people had to live next to the processing plants that produce their meat, right?
Yeah.
I grew up for a little while when I was in high school. I moved to a town that had a massive Tyson plant, like right down the street, like 10 miles away, and the entire like an hour's drive in any direction from the plant, all you could smell was animal shit. And,
yeah.
And like, it's really sad because the people who work there also, like, it's basically a company town. Yeah, you're exactly right, Come Gremlin. Like, you can hear the cows or the chickens in the plant. They have a massive amount of land outside of the plant that's dedicated to keeping most of the animals because they want to keep as many of the animals close as possible. And like 70 or 80% of the people who live in that town work at the plant. And it's like a really miserable sort of intersection of conditions where like the government is bringing in refugees, sending them to this town, and then making them work in a meat processing plant where they have to kill animals all day. And the rest work at the school or in the restaurants and the convenience stores, and that's like about it, right? Because it's just a little dot on the highway that you pass through. It's not like a big city. They don't put meat processing plants in big cities, and there's a reason for that.
Yeah.
I think that another thing that kind of speaks to is the lack of localization for food production, which I think is like a really big problem that we need to tackle as a society. That we've concentrated so much of our food production through industrialization into very specific areas that we've turned into bread baskets or into meat production areas, and then we just kind of like the people who are disconnected from the meat that they're eating. It's not just that they call it beef instead of cow, right? But also that they never have to be anywhere near the place that their food is made, and that they can have tomatoes shipped fresh to their city from anywhere in the world at any time of year. Or they can have fresh meat brought to them, but that they don't have to live around the consequences of meat production or the consequences of agriculture. Like the fact that cities don't have their own agriculture is kind of alarming, I think, in terms of a social model of sustainable development.
Oh yeah, man. I was funny. I was living in San Diego and I was listening to this PBS like station down there talk about like what happens to the oranges that we make in California and all that kind of stuff. And I'm like, well, obviously we eat them. It goes to the supermarket, right? And they're like, oh no, actually we ship them. We ship them to China, and then China ships over their own oranges. And it's like, what? Yep. It's like, oh yeah, it's way cheaper actually to just ship them worldwide. We sell them for higher prices in China, and we get the cheap ones sent to us because we, as Americans, just like the really brightly colored oranges. We don't like the ones that have like a bunch of taste in them. We just like the ones that are really, really brightly orange. And I mean, when you're talking about being disconnected from the process, it's so true, and it actually it goes to multiple issues too. So like, look, you can actually apply this to gasoline and stuff like that, where like we're not connected to the source of gasoline, which is a lot of basically mining and extracting a crude lysate, which is all the plant material that's hundreds of millions of years old. So a lot of plants and algae basically over hundreds of millions of years, the gravity of all that earth is going to take all that plant material and just smush it together. So you have all of these different plant elements along with the lipids, and the lipids becomes the gas, right? So you extract as a mining company, which is crazy to me. A gas company makes no materials. They don't make their own product. They just extract it from the
because of how labor intensive it is. Yeah.
Well, I mean, just imagine if like Apple like didn't have to design the new MacBook Air or whatever. They just had to dig and then find the MacBook Air, the next generation MacBook Air. It's like, it's very convenient. It must be really nice to have a company that actually doesn't produce a product and just refines a product, right? And yet we still subsidize these guys. It just blows my mind. It's such an easy job, and yet we still subsidize them. So but my point is that like the sourcing of the material, people don't live near these mines. They don't live near this stuff for the most part. And then it gets shipped to us after being processed. And then when we use our gasoline, we're actually not connected to the emissions part either, right? It's because when we're driving our car, we're just driving the car. We're not seeing all those tons of CO2 that are being put into the atmosphere. And then on the tail end, we're not actually connected with the problems that the CO2 in the atmosphere is going to have on other island nations or anything like that, or nations that are close to water, where they're like freaking out right now because they're like, dang, we're going to see like, 5 to 10 meters of rise in the next 100 years. So we got to like raise our stuff up now. So that you could say the same thing with like electric vehicles, with the batteries and the mining that's associated with that. You could say that with gasoline cars. You could say that with meat production. Like so much of our modern world is disconnected from the reality in which it sits.
Yeah, I think that tackling that problem is like one of the central problems that we need to really achieve like as many of our sustainable development goals as possible, right? Because achieving a lot of them is going to require us to rethink the question of logistics and like where things are coming from, how goods are distributed. Because like you were talking about with oranges, logistics oftentimes in the global economy is very inefficient. We're doing things that don't make a lot of sense because it's like gets a slightly higher premium on the market because Americans do want the brightest oranges. So we're going to ship away the ones that we grow in California or Florida to other countries and then import ones that sell better here. And those kinds of problems of localizing production, I think, are going to be really important and are something that you can convince people to get locally involved in, because what you're pushing for is people creating local sustainable economies, which they can do by being active in their own community.
Exactly.
That's not a federal policy, right? That's going to be something that communities have to take charge of on their own and like do development projects to figure out. Exactly. One of my favorite things to talk about for that is cities developing vertical farming projects, which I think are awesome and are probably going to be super important in the future for cities being sustainable unto themselves.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And like going to restaurants and stuff that have, farm to table options and stuff like that, and then saying like, hey, this is actually really cool, and a lot of it may be paying a little bit more for that. I think that's like the problem is that, the externalities and externalities is the official term for all the things that are the problematic parts outside of you actually using the whatever we're talking about, the gasoline or the food product and all that kind of stuff. If we take those externalities and kind of like bring them in, and it's going to be, it might be more expensive, because the problem is that we are exporting all the maladies or the bad things that are happening associated with that product. So dealing with them might take a little bit more money in order to actually fix that problem. So like for example, if we didn't have, a lot of things that are being made in China that where people are not being paid a living wage or have human rights abuses, if that is something that we want to deal with, and we want to have people being paid a living wage, and we don't want to be shipping it across the globe for the CO2 emissions, just paying people more to make things is going to make the products costs a little bit more. I think that's just the reality that we have to face, and that's okay. But you're okay with that because at least we have transparency now. Hopefully, we have an ability to know that people in these products aren't being made by people that aren't. They're being paid pretty much nothing.
Right. I think also that oh God, I had something to say. Oh no, my brain is doing it. Fuck. Sorry, I'm having a foggy brain morning.
That's okay. I love your.
I think that these.
Go ahead.
Oh, the vertical farming idea I think is really important. I think one of the big problems for sustainability is that cities are not sustainable unto themselves. If we can make cities self-sustaining, like pseudo-organisms that have the ability to produce their own food, process and clean their own water, produce their own power, a lot of the stress on the grid and in terms of our like net emissions will be taken care of. It seems like something really important that we can kind of push people towards.
Yeah, because cities are good in the fact that you can, a lot of times not have a car, or it's more efficient to, move things in mass to one location for a lot of people. But the problem is that it does require, again, like those externalities, exactly what we're talking about, the import of food and materials. So exactly what you're talking about is 100% correct. If cities can actually have urban farming, so that would be like using the tops of these skyscrapers and these buildings for sustainable foods, but also then if we have the ability to create like a warehouse, right, where you have, and what you're talking about with vertical farming is like there's multiple layers of the grow layer, right? Where you have, maybe you're doing micro ferns or something like that, or any type of small plant that only needs 12 inches of grow room, and then you have 100-foot high warehouse, let's say, or whatever. Then you can have multiple layers of the plants, and it's a lot more efficient. And then on top of that, you actually have indoor plants just in general. You can increase the photo period so they actually can harvest a lot quicker than the outdoors. You can control pests a lot easier. There's a lot of other things that increase as well. So I think that's kind of like where a lot of these cities and stuff are going to have to go. It's a big thing that people are investing a lot into right now.
Yeah, I think that it's funny that when we talk about cities like this, I think there are some people who do really care about climate change, but who take the conclusion that cities are unsustainable to the wrong place. And I think that vertical farming is a really good way to talk about the difference between those two positions, because some people get kind of like, it feels like they're on like a primitivist arc, or like they want to go into Luddism as a response to how bad industrialization has fucked up the climate.
Yeah.
And the solution is not to abandon the model of the city. Like that's not something that people will ever want to do, and it's not. It wouldn't be good for human civilization either. But we need to find a way to make the city itself ecologically sustainable. So I think that's really important. But the other thing I was going to say before my brain farted out earlier, that I've now remembered, is there's a term that I like to use when I think about the problem of like subsidies and cost for a lot of goods, and it's just that like people are very used to living beyond their means, and they're very comfortable that way ecologically. Like humanity has been living beyond its means because of industrialization for a really long time. We've experienced goods that are way too cheap, that shouldn't be as cheap as they are, and that we've produced entirely too much of, and that there shouldn't be that many of them naturally in the economy. And we've subsidized that boom in growth. The fact that meat is so cheap, or that gas is so cheap, is something that now we're all used to, and that people would lose their minds if you told them that the price of gas was going to multiply times 5 tomorrow because we got rid of subsidies, or that like now ground beef costs $20 a pound. I think that those kinds of changes are part of the thing that makes it really hard, or that makes those those policy changes that need to be made on a large level pretty intractable for people, and that you can change the way that people think about those problems by using this more positive, sustainable development type language to talk them through, like, well, the issue is really like, look at how all these industries affect the sustainability of the environment. Look at how they have all of these runoff effects and also contribute to net emissions. But we could change them to not do that if we were to reorient like how production itself works. Because I think that problem gets framed very often in terms just of the production, but like changing consumption is a necessary part of that equation, not just changing the way we produce the things that we have.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's interesting, this kind of like work from home kind of like new reality people have. I never would have thought that was like an option that would have happened. It's actually interesting. A lot of the stuff with the COVID changes to society actually makes me really optimistic about this problem, about the climate change problem, because it's like, dang, dude, like the entire world shifted in weeks. You know, we were able to completely change how we were interacting with work and just overnight, you know, and I think that shows kind of like the malleability of the of humans just in general. And it actually makes me a lot more optimistic about the future, which it's kind of like a weird thing that's coming from this pandemic, but I think we can change. But I think the biggest thing to think about is keeping the material condition better or the same. I don't think that you can create like a better, more sustainable, renewable world that, you know, that impacts people negatively.
Right.
And if you look at, this is what figure 3 goes into. I mean, you can look at the cost of photovoltaics and wind energy and batteries for passenger electric vehicles. You know, the costs are coming down dramatically from where they were 20 years ago. So this isn't some just like crazy off in the distance thing. I mean, my friends at the DOE, you know, I mean, they're pretty much, their guidelines and their horizons is that basically the United States is going to be like all electric vehicles by like 2050. So it's coming. It's going to come. It's like it's happening right now. So
it's crazy how much the cost of battery technology has dropped in the last 20 years.
Yeah,
you know, like this chart for how expensive batteries are is wild.
Exactly.
Where now we have like very, very reliable and sustainable batteries. It's not like it used to be that batteries were expensive and didn't hold very much in terms of energy.
Yeah.
And now we have very cheap batteries that can hold a lot of energy.
I would have thought that
it is promising.
I would have thought that, you know, because of the rare earth minerals and stuff, there is some of that, but the super rare stuff. But lithium, for example, is pretty much kind of ubiquitous on Earth, which is kind of nice. So we can have multiple lithium mines. We're not like tied to just the largest landmass countries like Russia, China, and the continent of Africa. You know, it's like we're actually able to have lithium mines like in the United States, and we have rare earth minerals mines here too. So I think that's like part of it is figuring out like these electric vehicles and their batteries and stuff. What are we going to do with their waste, the battery waste, and how can we dispose of that and recycle that? And then also, how do we make that mining process more efficient? And because I think last time I looked into it, I think a lithium is actually like extracted from the ground in a similar process to fracking. I thought that was kind of interesting. They basically crack open the rock in order to extract the lithium with a similar process to fracking and then remove it. So it's not necessarily like mountaintop removal, right? It's not just like how you'd think coal mines or something in like West Virginia are, where they just kind of like level the entire
they do.
So
yeah, the real stickler in terms of rare earth minerals for batteries is like nickel and cadmium, right? Lithium is relatively easy to get. It's the other heavy metals that are harder to find.
Yeah, and that's another stickler for nuclear energy, right? Where you're just like, I mean, how prevalent are those, like uranium and all these, these super rare earth minerals that are really hard to find. So it's and then on top of that, it's something where it's just, for me, like nuclear, it's weird how people get so focused on that. But and just like we were talking about, like emissions are just one way that we are impacting the problem, and that is just one solution to one way that we are impacting the problem. So it's very it's really dialing it down into something where you're like, I don't know if it's really productive to think about just this one emissions thing so minutely, and especially like you're talking about with the graph, figure 7, like it doesn't even have that big of an impact on it. But that is like, you inevitably you talk to someone about that doesn't really have a background in this stuff. They're talking about nuclear energy and CO2 ppms. That's what your entire conversation is going to be about.
Oh yeah. It's funny to me, too, when people suggest nuclear power as a large-scale solution, because it's like, it's fine to put up a couple of new nuclear power plants, but the idea that we are going to be able to get through all of the policy red tape that it takes to lay down 100 new nuclear plants in the United States in the next, 30 years is, insane to me. There is no way. It takes so long to get the construction process even approved by Congress for a nuclear power plant.
Yeah.
And then it takes another 10 years after approval for the construction process to finish before they can even start thinking about taking the plant online. Mm-hmm. And then it requires all of this additional oversight and government cooperation where the Department of Energy has to be involved, the IAEA has to be involved, and it's like, even beyond all of the safety concerns, there are some valid safety concerns, but the other thing is that, when we're using Generation 4 reactors, I think most of the new reactors the United States puts up are considered Generation 4 reactors. They're relatively safe, and we have better cooling technology, and we have a safer way to design plants so that they don't melt down in the United States. We're not really as worried about having a Fukushima as we are spending $2 billion per power plant to wait 30 years for it to get up. Mm-hmm. Because each individual plant is going to have to go through a bill on the docket in Congress, and it takes so long for that to happen. We can't just lump them all together and say, does Congress approve 100 new nuclear power plants all at the same time?
Yeah.
Because you have to submit the plans for the power plant to the government, and then those plans get partially redacted for security reasons so that terrorists can't attack the nuclear power plant. Because I remember when I was debating the energy topic, nuclear was a super popular argument for people to make in support of the topic.
Yeah.
And when you try to, one of the arguments people would make against nuclear power is that it's unsafe because if a terrorist flies a plane into the power plant, that you're going to have a meltdown no matter what. And trying to find the schematics that are not redacted for a nuclear power plant is pretty much impossible. You can download the schematics from the government, but half of the document is just going to be entirely redacted.
Yeah, I bet that's pretty funny. Yeah, so is this where? So these people were making the argument that nuclear would be a good way to go forward in order to mitigate the energy problems that we're having? Is that what the...
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. It's kind of like a... Yeah. It's interesting. And you said it was for the debates for... it was a debate team, you said?
Yeah, I was on a debate team in college.
Oh, okay, cool. Very cool. Yeah, I think it's one of those things where I don't want to say bad faith or anything like that, but there's talking points that people have, understanding the understanding issues, and I think that's just something that gets an abnormal amount of attention. There's a lot of different ways that humans are impacting the environment negatively, and it's really frustrating to me. I'm biased. I do research in algae biofuels, and it really frustrates me that algae biofuels are never brought up, and yet that's the way that we could actually create a renewable fuel for all the cars that exist right now. My 92 Ford Ranger truck could be
Yeah.
a renewable energy truck, on algae biofuels, and we could use the trillions of dollars that we have invested in infrastructure and tanks and pipes and all this kind of stuff, and it just never gets talked about, and yet nuclear kind of like steals the show, but it's still kind of like tenuous because you still need battery technology. And I think that's the thing that really makes me mad about nuclear, is that it always ends with this like, yeah, but we can almost get there. We can get there. We can get there to if we just focus on battery development, we focus on nuclear technology development. And it's like, dude, we actually have the technology now already. We already have the ability to do this stuff in order to make it more to mitigate our problems that we're having in the environment. But it's a way to couch the issue where it's like, it's a future problem still. It's a future problem still. It's like, no, man, it's a now problem and we have now solutions. So let's do something about it.
That is one of the most frustrating parts about talking to people who want to kind of defer it to the future. That they just like, oh, well, somebody smart in the future will figure it out, but it's not something that we can solve now. And it's like, that's a really flawed way to look at the problem. The problem is so complex and exists over such a long period of time that we can't just like hit the snooze button and say, no, somebody else in the future will have a solution for this. Algae biofuels are really interesting to me. They were a big part of the energy topic as well, actually, when I debated it. Debating about algae biofuels is always really cool. Because they are one of the more viable, like short-term kind of replacements for fossil fuels. And while I'm of the opinion that ending fossil fuel subsidies would be a good policy idea, it's an unrealistic policy idea at the same time. No politician is going to support ending fossil fuel subsidies. So we need to find a way to sort of wean the population off of their reliance on fossil fuels. And one of the best ways to do that is to not tell them, now we're making it so that your gasoline car will never run again.
Yeah. I think that's kind of
because you're not
like a
going to win
dickish
people
move,
that
right?
way.
Because it's like, dude, like a lot of people don't even want to buy another car. They're over cars. They hate cars. So, but now we got to tell people, oh, you got to buy another car now. And it's kind of like, dang, man, like I just bought a car, like, what do you mean? Or I don't want to have a car at all. And now I have to have a specific car, this electric vehicle thing. It kind of, and I mean, we're always going to have, like, for example, like we're going to have combustion engines. They're going to exist. Like for airplane travel, it doesn't make any sense to have an electric vehicle, like motor. You do the calculations, the physics and the math, and it's impossible basically to put a 747 within a motor, electric motor. Because the problem with electric vehicles is that you need more batteries to drain when you're going really fast or need a bunch of power output, but the batteries add more weight. And now because of that added weight, now you need more energy, the motor. And
I was just thinking that, right?
Problem.
It's about the proportion of the weight of the fuel to how much of it you need. Because like you can get a lot of power out of like the amount of fuel that a 747 can carry. But to get an equivalent amount of power out of batteries, you'd have so much more weight in fuel.
Exactly.
And then the power becomes insufficient because you added weight. Yeah, that's an interesting problem.
Exactly. And I mean, thankfully, this is something that can be solved with algae, actually, with the airplane fuel, jet fuel and stuff. Algae is able to make the complex hydrocarbons that are needed for jet fuel and combustion engines. So we can actually use algae biofuels for aviation. That's a huge way that we can focus on our using that technology. I'm biased though. I work with algae a lot, so that's why.
It's cool. It's cool to hear that though, because I don't think I've ever gotten to talk to somebody who works with algae biofuels about that specifically. That's the argument that people made about algae biofuels on the energy topic too, is they would say that we need to be able to switch the Air Force and other parts of the military off of their reliance on jet fuel. Because of how damaging it is to the environment, and because of how much of the military is responsible for like our total emissions portfolio. The military emits a lot. And being able to replace all of their fuel with algae biofuel would be like a massive step in terms of reducing our net emission.
I remember,
and that's something you could do through policy. It's the military.
Exactly.
We make policy for the military all the time.
Exactly. Yeah, I remember in 2010, I was at conferences where they're talking about the Navy. The Navy was one of the bigger pushers within the DoD to go to renewable, because it's as soon as it's a national defense thing, it's like now all of a sudden there's all this money and all this push in order to do it, and it's like, well, we want to sustain our own, have a sustainable way to actually run our jets, to run our boats or whatever like that. We need a sustainable fuel, and we can make it at home in the USA. Like, we don't have to import it from another country. Like, done. So I remember a bunch of Navy presentations talking about that specifically. They wanted to go 50% renewable by 2020, but
well, it improves military readiness, right? Because then if we go to war with a country that is responsible for exporting a huge amount of the stuff we rely on to fuel our military,
exactly,
we're in a pretty bad spot. Right?
Exactly. Look at what's happening with Russia right now and Germany.
Yeah.
What a weird scenario, right? Where they're like, okay, so we might have to mobilize troops using Russian oil in order to combat Russia possibly in the future. Like, it gets a weird scenario where now they're, nations don't like that. So that's like one way of like geopolitics, and can kind of like come together with sustainable models and stuff like that. So there's a lot of different ways that people can interact with it. There's a lot of solutions, man. I think in general, I'm actually pretty optimistic about this like problem. I think like we have a lot of the solutions, and they're only getting better. So the technology is only getting better over time. There's a lot of science that's going on that people don't know about, like into plastics, into bioplastics, like I was talking about before, or biomaterials. There's a lot of research going on into sustainable food, lab-grown meats and fish, and algae too as food. And then there's also fuels and stuff like that. So a lot of research going into there. So, and it's all has to do with kind of like plants. So that's the kind of like, I'm basically a plant scientist, where I'm working on chloroplast and the photosynthesis, trying to improve that process. And I think there's a lot of research going on right now that people don't know about, and that's kind of like what my channel is about in YouTube, and that's why I do this stuff, because I want to reach out and tell people that there's awesome stuff happening in science right now, not to feel doomer about it at all, because it's happening. So like, get involved in whatever way that I think that you or anyone watching wants to.
Yeah. I totally agree with that. I think there's lots of issues that you can find that you probably already care about, at least one of them that has a substantial impact on the problem.
Exactly.
And that it's easy to pick something that you already want to pursue in terms of like changing something about society, where if you work on that problem and you keep the sustainable development mindset in your head when you're working on it, that you can do good work for the future of society without having to turn yourself into a climatologist or a scientist of some kind who's developing a new solenoid, or who's working on new battery technology or something like that. Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, and even in the market of this is kind of like the new wave of things. There's a lot of good, like high paying technology jobs that are associated with kind of like these sustainable development goals too. So, I mean, there are a lot of people that believe that, for example, humans aren't impacting the climate of the Earth. I mean, obviously it is, I think, based off of science, and you can prove that. But
I think it's pretty easy to say that it is. Yeah.
Yeah. But these people don't. Okay. So that's fine. They believe that. It's like, whatever. So, but at the same time, they have a photovoltaic company, and they're installing solar panels, and they're like, whatever, you guys, I know how to do this really well. I can install these things, and I can get paid for it. And whether or not that person agrees that if it's like a natural cycle or a human caused cycle that's happening, it's like, whatever, man, just keep installing those photovoltaics.
Yeah, right. We can make it so that the actions that people take have positive impact on the problem, even if the sort of disposition or like knowledge that they think they have about the problem would normally be counterproductive. I totally agree. I mean, I think that does at a certain level require policymaking, because we can change people's like attitudes or like expectations at an individual level about society and what the future is going to be. But I think that ultimately we need to, the way that the market is laid out now is not one that incentivizes that kind of action. So we need to change the way that market incentives work from a governmental standpoint to encourage people to take those kinds of actions, even if they don't believe in climate change.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, a lot of it is just getting people involved, getting involved and at every level at City Hall, at the federal level, there's kind of like there's this weird ethanol to food connection because of the Clinton administration. They passed something where they mandated 10% of all our gasoline has to be ethanol. And that kind of, and if you look at it ever since that bill passed, it's kind of tied the price of fuel to food in a weird way. Like a bushel of corn has increased in value significantly since that bill was passed. And it kind of like incentivizes people to grow corn at an abnormally high rate. And as we shift more to photovoltaics and electric vehicles, it's going to be an interesting question of like how we actually use that extra corn, use the extra materials that we have, the capacity to grow that corn that we don't normally, that we're normally using in combustion engines. Like, what are we going to do with that? So maybe we could scale back some of these corn farms. Maybe we could incentivize people instead of it going to, gas companies and stuff like that. Maybe we could incentivize people to have solar arrays, wind farms, algae biofuel ponds, that kind of stuff. I mean, these are tangible, real applications that people can do with technology that exists right now. This isn't like we just got to wait till battery technology gets to the next level. It's like, no, we got it. We have the technology now. We just need people to kind of shift their thinking, and especially the ethanol requirement is a good way. Exactly what you're talking about, how it ties a bill to actions, and it has knock-on effects for decades. So the EPA can have a big impact on that.
And especially the knock-on effects with making a policy about the military are huge, right? Because there's this entire industrial apparatus that exists around the military just to support it. And that's where a lot of government contracting comes from. And a lot of technology and innovation has actually come from the military issuing some kind of, bid for a contract for a new technology that they want to implement. Mm-hmm. And then a bunch of businesses chase after that contract, and they have a reason to do something that otherwise wouldn't have been profitable or would have been too risky in the market. Oh, yeah. And I think doing something like converting some of your land that you use for corn farming into an algae pond where you can, produce algae at a large level that can be converted into biofuels is something that you'd need a financial incentive to do, because the market doesn't exist for it in the way that you need it to build a project on that level. So I think that greening the military is actually like a really good issue to talk to people about when you want to try to get them on the same page with sustainable development, especially in America, because people across the political spectrum, even like a lot of liberals, are generally pro-military and support the military a lot and want the U.S. to have a strong and sustainable military. And so it makes it very easy to frame sustainable development as also being a part of national defense, or a part of like being a good patriot, or whatever it is that you want to use rhetorically to convince somebody.
Yeah, I mean, that people don't realize, and I didn't realize this until a couple of years ago, like the DoD has more money. It's about $90 billion a year. That amount is more than every other federal agency dedicated to science research combined. So that's more than the NSF, NIH, DOE, all these agencies combined. The DoD does more stuff and research into it. Full disclosure, I have a fellowship with the DoD right now. So,
congrats!
Thank you. So so that's where my research funding is coming from too. So and I know that, and when I was working in the algae biofuels lab in 2010, the same thing. There was a lot of money that was from the DoD in these research labs. So it's one of those ways where, I don't agree with like the budget increasing from $300 billion to $800 billion in the last 20 years. I don't agree with a lot of what the policies and what we're doing to other nations and all that kind of stuff. The politics aside, I think that there is a way though that if you're like you say, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party are on the same page on this issue, that the DoD is kind of like this vessel of how we research and like a jobs program. Then let's lay into it. You know what I mean? Let's figure out ways that are working and then fix those ways and like push it. Let's not try to reinvent the wheel here. You know, we're trying to prevent the extinction of the human species. We're not trying to like start everything from the ground up. And I feel like that's kind of like the doomer like accelerationism thing, where people are like, no, it needs to completely crumble. Society needs to, like exactly what you're talking about, kind of like a societal collapse, and then we'll finally be able to like figure out the issue. And it's like, I mean, I hope not. I mean, I hope billions of people don't have to die in order for us to take this issue seriously. I hope we can, get things together and actually improve the material conditions of people, get people with good paying jobs that are sustainable and working in renewables that all throughout this country, that we actually desperately need this. And it's really sad for me to see the Green New Deal is kind of like something where I was bewildered by it. Like when you read it, it's so short, and it talks about kind of ideals rather than policy. And the first half of it is outlining IPCC reports. It's actually kind of boring, and then the last half is kind of talking about ideals and where we need to put this money and why we need to put this money in those places. And I agree with it, but I wish there was more. Like we do need a Green New Deal, and that people can like have like exactly what you're talking about, converting their corn farms into algae biofuel ponds. We need these photovoltaic production, battery production. These are all like new 21st century jobs that are ways for our country, or the United States, I should say. I live in the United States.
Me too.
We can actually be a player in the future if we actually lead on these issues, and it's something that you could actually like stir the patriotic strings in like both parties. I feel like to actually care about this issue in a different way, and it's just go like. And I think bringing it back to the IPCC report, it's just like, go King, like whatever you want to do, dude. Like there's so many ways to do it. Just do whatever you want to do. You don't have to like have like a particular issue. We're not trying to do this new world government, new world order kind of thing. Like if you just increased, like I'm a contractor and I do new buildings with high energy performance materials. Done. Like whatever it takes.
Just do whatever you can in your line of work or in your area of expertise or your area of personal interest. If you're going to go out there and be more politically active, that you can affect, that ties into the problem, and just use that sustainable development mindset to do that. It's like, even somebody who's a contractor who's putting up high energy buildings, there's a ton of decisions they can make and how they want to produce a building that changes the energy footprint or the carbon footprint of that building by a lot.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Huge. It makes a huge difference. Like I remember at UC San Diego, they were building new buildings, and like they said that just the orientation of the building, how the building was able, it actually reminded me of those huge termite mounds in Australia. Have you seen those things?
No, I don't think so.
Oh, they're like 6 to 8 feet tall. Man, they're huge. And they actually have, these termite mounds actually have central AC, and they have all these amazing, it's crazy. If proportioned from, termites to these mounds for our humans, in order to make something that's that large in proportion to us, the building would have to be a mile high. So these things are gigantic. And the termites actually, they actually point them all in the same direction, because then that allows the morning sun to kind of like heat up the one side, and then on the other side, as the sun goes down during the heat of the day, it doesn't align with the sun then. So then they have like central AC and all this kind of stuff. And it kind of reminds me of that building where they were actually doing something similar, where they had an ability for the building to kind of like heat up naturally over the day. So they're not paying for heating. They're not burning clean natural gas in order to do that. And then at the heat of the day, during the later of the day, then now they have more reflective materials on the other side that are able to kind of like disperse some of that heat. So there's a lot of like different ways that people can get involved. Like even, man, like if people are like the pandemic. Like you can think about the pandemic and the global permafrost melting and kind of unleashing these new viruses that our immune system has never seen because they're 100 million years old. So it's like, that if you're still scared about SARS-CoV-2, you could even bring that into it. Like literally anything.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a complex problem and it affects the entire planet. So it has basically a tie-in to any other issue that exists on the surface of the planet because it's going to transform the environment so fundamentally that it's like an interpenetrating issue. It's intersectional, right? It's like something that touches everything so much that we can care about it in a myriad of different ways. So like anything that you want to care about that you can contribute to sustainable change in will affect the problem. And I think that it's interesting the difference in framing between the sixth assessment and the fifth assessment, because the fifth assessment seemed very it was a policymakers summary, but like the focus for policymakers was basically like you have to pass cap and trade, right? It was it was all emissions focused. And I think while emissions is super important, being able to break down the problem in the way that they have here is a lot more digestible for the average person who wants to think about what they can do in their daily life and not just think about the monumental challenge of trying to climb a mountain in a single day, which is what the demands of the report looked like last time. So I think that this kind of framing that it's done is really good. And I think that it's going to produce some really interesting conversations around sustainable development and climate change, like this one.
I hope so. I hope it. Exactly. It doesn't. It's not. You don't have to be like a STEM scientist in order to contribute to this. That's the big takeaway for me too. It's like just figure out what you care about, what your passion is, if you care about this issue, and then figure out like how you want to impact it. You could be an environmental lawyer, you could be a contractor, you could be a ton of different ways. Even gender equality. It really it's like you said, it's all encompassing, and there's just some really cool science going on, about it. There's cool things that are happening that when we develop these technologies in the future too, it's going to be even more like of a big impact, I feel like, in the space. So I'm actually I'm optimistic about us trying to deal with this future. I think it's a huge driver towards things that we should probably be kind of like what you were talking about before, thinking about already. Like we should have already been thinking and connecting ourselves more with our food and our impacts to the environment. So it's kind of like driving us to a way that's more holistic and not putting humans above nature. And I think that's the biggest problem, the framing of people and how they saw nature, is that this was kind of like a resource that humans can use. And in reality, it's, a healthy environment is tied to a healthy human health. Or the health of humans is tied to a healthy environment. So they're not separated at all.
Yeah, completely true. The health of the rest of society is always going to reflect whether or not we have a symbiotic relationship with the environment or a parasitic one, in my opinion. And I think a lot of the sustainable development movement is about taking humanity's relationship from being more parasitic or exploitative towards the environment around us and making us exist sort of in concert with it in a much more sustainable way, because that's what sustainability really means. It can't just be sustainable for the next 50 years. It's about being sustainable indefinitely and making it so that future generations of people who are born on the planet don't have to ask questions about where all the fresh water has gone or why there's no arable land. Yeah,
I know, right? That's one of the biggest fears, is like having like a coral reef in a natural history museum. It's like, damn, man, that's like just talking about that stellar sea cow example. Like that really hits home to me. The idea that there wouldn't be like that connection with the environment. And I feel like that's a good way to figure out how people can get involved, is getting like touching, as the kids say nowadays, go touch grass, go outside and see how people what intrigues you? You know, what do you care about, and see like how you're gonna have that impact. What do you care the most about, and then try to figure out like if anyone is in like trying to find their career, or trying to figure out, you know, what am I going to do for my life, you know, goals and stuff like that. Like, what are the biggest problems? So if you think climate change is, or humans' impact on it, now like try to figure out your how you're going to weasel into that, or impact that the most. And there's a lot of different ways, and they're all good. They're all good. There's nothing better than the other, in my opinion.
Yeah, for sure. I agree with that.
Well, thanks, man. I really appreciate talking to you. I'm talking to, I didn't know that I was in Heem's chat the other day, and then you have, I saw you're a mod in there.
Yeah, I mod for Heem and for Rhizome, and
oh, really?
I think that's, yeah, and for a couple of the other Heem orbiting crew as well. But
cool, man.
I'm mostly a chatter. I'm a chatter who streams. It's kind of how I think about myself. But yeah, this was an awesome conversation. You're welcome to come back on anytime to talk about anything if you want to.
Cool.
You want to shout yourself out?
Yeah, I have a YouTube channel that I just linked it in the chat. That's I don't really stream on Twitch. I have a Twitch account, but I don't really stream in there. So if you could subscribe on my YouTube channel, I have a bunch of things going over the video that's the most popular right now is me debating Haas on whether or not genes are real. So that's a fun one.
That was a good one. I watched that conversation. That one was funny.
So yeah, it was. You know, I mean, the whole goal for my channel is to try to kind of like do science outreach with it. You know, I'm a scientist first, and so I'm interested in how science can like be more connected in this space. So that's why I reached out to Heem, for example, because I know that he's a grad student. So I also I like Homozygote. I'm in his community too, he does a lot of good work there, trying to just digest what's going on in the COVID space. So I think like science just needs to be more involved and go where people are. And this is where a lot of people are. And I think that we can raise the level of discourse in this space by bringing actual science to it, and talking about the cool things that are happening in science. And nobody talks about them. It's really frustrating. Like engineered, one of my favorite things that's happened is the engineered virus-like nanoparticles that have been used to cure blindness and genetic blindness in mice. It's like, that was just such a cool paper for me. And so I have a video on it on my YouTube channel.
Yeah.
Stuff like that, where it's just like, dang, why isn't anyone talking about this? And I have to get it out. So I made my YouTube channel to kind of talk about it. So
that's awesome. I think that is a really good contribution to the discourse. And I really enjoy that that's the way that you want to tackle things, because I think when a lot of people engage with science, they think about it as either, oh, that's like smart guy stuff, that's way too daunting for me to understand. Or they think that, like, especially when it comes to climate change or other like more doomer issues, they're like, oh, well, science is just like, it's about, finding some solution to a catastrophic problem that exists. But there are a lot of innovations in science that improve our daily life that we can think about in a really positive and interesting way, that can be engaging to people, even if they're not scientists themselves. Like, I'm a psychology student. I'm not a scientist, but I really enjoy reading and understanding the kinds of things that are going on in science.
Yeah, man. Well, if you ever see like a biology article, or my main background is like biology, so if you ever see an article you want to talk about, or whatever, just let me know, and we can talk about it.
Hell yeah, I definitely will. I will hit you up about that if I find something cool.
All right, sounds good, man. Talk to you soon then.
Yeah, take care.
See ya. Sweet. I think that went really well. Cool. This is like the first of many reach outs that I've done, trying to get more involved. I don't know if you're still here, Frank. You are. So hopefully, I got some coming up. So got another one today, well, tomorrow at 4 a.m., that's going to be another one. And, yeah, man. Yeah, we'll see. I love it. I love talking to people that are interested in science and trying to figure out how we can do this. So